Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or two to let more people filter in to the webinar, and then we'll get started. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the Education Writers Association's latest webinar, Brainwaves, covering how the science of learning translates to the classroom. I'm Lori Crouch, EWA's Assistant Director. Before we begin, let me go over some housekeeping items. If you have a question for our speakers, type them into the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. Please include your name and affiliation when you ask your question, and please ask your question anytime and we'll get to them during the Q&A at the end. I'll also note that we're going to ask that journalists get priority on asking questions if you're not a journalist. As soon as the webinar closes, you'll see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is important and helps us improve. Today, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Emily Hanford of APM Reports, to get started on this conversation. Emily has written extensively or reported extensively on the science of reading, so she knows this topic well, and I can't think of many other people who would be as good at being a moderator. So take it away, Emily.
Thank you, Lori. Good afternoon, or maybe morning, or whatever time it is where you are. I'm really excited about the panel we have with us today to talk about a topic that I find endlessly fascinating and especially urgent. Urgent because of COVID and the learning loss that so many students have experienced and probably, unfortunately, are going to continue to experience this upcoming school year. And urgent because so much is known about how we learn, how our brains work, what little kids and big kids and all of us need from their teachers and their schools to maximize their potential and their opportunity to learn. So much is known, and yet translating this stuff into practice and helping educators access and understand what is now known about how we learn, this is a really, really big challenge. And it is a challenge that the people we have on this panel are all working on in various really interesting ways. So let me introduce them. Meg Lee is the Director of Organizational Development for the Frederick County Public Schools in Maryland. And she's also the author of a book, Mindsets for Parents, Strategies to Encourage Growth Mindsets in Kids. We also have Glenn Whitman, who is also in Maryland. He's the Executive Director of the Center for Transformative Teaching and Learning at St. Andrew's Episcopal School, and also the author of a book, NeuroTeach, Brain Science and the Future of Education. And we have Tracey Tokuhama-Espinosa. She is an instructor at Harvard University Extension School, and she is the author of a book, Neuromyths, Debunking False Ideas About the Brain. So I'm going to start with Tracey and ask you, Tracey, to give us just a little bit of an introduction to this topic. What do reporters in particular really need to know about the science of learning, and what are some of the biggest myths about brain science and how people learn?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Emily. And also, it's great to be here with Meg and Glenn, just wonderful practitioners in the field. So great to see that and be with you. I think that we have to come from a really big challenge of looking at the science of learning and sort of moving it to being a science of teaching. And that's really a fascinating thing. We've been studying the science of learning for about 125 years. We have a lot of information about how the brain learns. But we have a hard time getting to this, over this hump, into what does that look like in practice? What is usable knowledge? How do we actually turn that information into practical applications that teachers can really hang on to? And we have this really bigger challenge that after we invested a lot of money in the 1990s into the decade of the brain and started to get a little bit of knowledge, you've heard the saying, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. Well, it actually sparked a whole lot of interest in the field, which was fantastic. And so you got all kinds of people with a lot of big interest in learning more about the learning sciences, so neuroscience, psychology, cognitive sciences, and how that contributes to understanding how humans learn best in classrooms. And because there was not a lot of good translational research out there, there wasn't a lot of people who were sending the message, and particularly in this case, journalistic moves actually hooked onto or jumped onto a lot of the things that people were saying, but without a lot of evidence. And so we had a lot of half-truths out there that became these big neuromyths that started getting echoed, like people use 10% of their brains, or men's and women's brains are so different, and or that people are right-brained and left-brained. And so you had a bunch of these myths jump out there, and all of the myths just do so much harm because they limit an individual's potential. If you tell a girl, oh, you have a really good literary mind, but you don't have a mind for science, you do harm, right? Or if you tell somebody that, you only use 10% of your brain and, oops, you're full, that does harm. So we know that there's a lot of harm done by myths, but getting those better translators out there is actually something that is just beginning to occur. And I think that Glenn's programs and Meg's programs really point to that. Helping teachers on the ground floor understand the core principles and real information that's out there to help them actually apply that in the classroom is a big step. But then on the popular press move, we had a lot of people who were filling in the gaps because researchers were not speaking to the teachers clearly enough. Teachers were grabbing onto any information they could find, and they were finding in the study that I did around 2008, about 80% of the things that were taught to teachers about the brain was just junk. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to correct that because part of the problem is this momentum. Oh, I saw it in the press, it must be true. I saw it in the newspaper, it must be true. And that is in part the responsibility of good journalists to make sure that they have the most up-to-date information. The field is changing really fast. We've learned more about the brain in the past 15 years than we've known in the past 1,500 years. So it's really changed a lot. So what you thought you knew 30 years ago is not really what's up to date now. So I think there's a lot of challenges that we have to face here, but it's never been a better time to be an educator because the information, the quality is there. We just have to find a better way to make sure that that's communicated to teachers.
Thank you. That was great. That was a great introduction. I'm going to talk to you, turn to you, Glenn. You're actually a teacher. You're a history teacher. You've written a book about brain science, which I mentioned a moment ago, and you run this center for transforming teaching that's actually based at a school, which is really fascinating. So why do you think it's been so hard to get this research into practice? And tell us a little bit about what you're doing at your center.
Yeah, no, thanks, Emily, Tracy, Meg. I love this dream team of friends. I would say this. We were inspired as a school first, just outside Washington, D.C., in some ways by the 1997 article by John Brewer, which a number of people know, right? And Tracy's laughing, right? He talked about this bridge too far. The idea of research that emanates maybe from a university lab or is done in conjunction with schools to get into the everyday classroom is a bridge too far. Well, I think all of us can attest that we've closed that gap. And the reason why is because school-based organizations, which is somewhat of an anomaly, right? We are a teacher-led, school-based, preschool through 12, science of learning, science of teaching research center. And what we do is we sit in that gap that Tracy talked about between the researchers and the everyday practice of teachers. But why is it so hard, right? I mean, I often joke, I'm from New Jersey, so I'm a little sarcastic, but I often say there might be only one educational truth. And Meg knows this, so you're hearing this for the 4,000th time. Every day, every kid in every school, public, private, charter, homeschool, international, you name it, will have their brain. Now, I don't think any reporter on this call or anybody in education can refute that, but it's not a requirement to know about the learning sciences as pre-service programs, teacher prep programs around the country in all the thousands of schools. So what we've been trying to do is what level can we get in teacher-friendly, next day applicable resources built by teachers, the most promising research and strategies in the field that they can try out in their context and with their kids. And there's great stories. I mean, to be gathered here. We've created a network around this country, an informal network of schools and teachers, whether public school systems as big as Meg's at Frederick County or smaller school systems. Chris County, Georgia, the poorest county school district in Georgia, is training their faculty and teachers in educational neuroscience through our virtual platform called NeuroTeach Global. So again, I'm hopeful that we're moving the needle, but it's still, it's some of it's messaging, taking some of the fear out of it. When we talk about educational neuroscience or cognitive science, teachers get a little intimidated. Don't. It's fully accessible. Read Tracey stuff, listen to Meg. It's accessible. So I think a little fear factor we got to get over, a little better messaging, which reporters can help us on, and just good practical resources and next day strategies for teachers that they don't have to think too hard about, that they can try and see if they work. That might be the next secret sauce to grow this movement, and especially as we respond to the impact COVID has had on cohesive learning experiences.
Yeah, I'm going to come back a little bit more to that COVID and learning loss, but I actually want to turn to you, Meg, because I think one of the I think more and more individual people, individual teachers, parents are accessing a lot of this stuff about the science of learning and are trying to do something with it. But what I found in my own reporting is that a big impediment here is that so many public school systems are these big, large bureaucracies, and making anything happen, making anything change is really hard. There are these big, stubborn systems. So Meg actually works in a big public school system. She's working with Glenn and where he is on really making some change in the Frederick County Public Schools. So Meg, can you tell us a little, I think you've been with that system for more than 25 years, so I'm sure you have seen all kinds of things come and go over that time. So tell us about what you're doing in Frederick County Schools, and in particular, tell us about why you're so adamant that the people that you work with don't think of this as an initiative or a program or a project or the thing that the new superintendent is doing.
That's right. Thank you for asking that, Emily. Frederick County is an amazing place to work. We have about 44,000 students, 6,000 employees. We're located right in the middle of Maryland, and so we have a lot to offer. But we also share the same challenges that public districts across the United States share. So we share the challenges of achievement and equity gaps. We share challenges of strategic hiring. We share challenges of students who are living in poverty, who have social emotional challenges. So as I have been able to talk to people around the United States, they've shared with me that their challenges are our challenges. And that's part of the reason why Frederick has been inspirational to other districts. And I think when you talk about moving a large system, it really takes a lot of people who sit back and think really deeply about what's in the best interest of students first. And really, for us, we were really looking at what's going to move the needle in terms of student achievement for us. We're a high achieving system, but we weren't going to sit on our laurels. And so as we started to get into the space, we started with some work in mindset. And as many of your reporter friends probably know, that's one of those issues that, mindsets exploded and then was misinterpreted in many cases and oversimplified. And Frederick really took the approach that it was more than just putting a poster on a wall, but it was really how are we going to make decisions based on what we know about neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change over time. And so our belief in that changeable brain, and the changeable brain, not just of our students, but of our teachers and our employees, for them to think and grow and change the way they're making connections, really led us into the space of mind-brain education and the science of learning. And instead of it becoming an initiative for us, it really became the way our initiatives live in our system. For instance, we do have some systemic priorities. We have priorities in the area of equity. We have priorities in the area of our teacher evaluation system, which tells us what great teaching is, and teacher collaboration around student data. But these things needed practical strategies that were grounded in evidence to work. And so mind-brain education in Frederick County is not a thing that we do. It's how we do what we do, and it's how we make decisions, particularly now, about what is in the best interest of our students and our staff. And I think that really comes with strong leadership from a superintendent who believes, a deputy superintendent who believes, who model the work. Our Board of Education supports and models our work, our teacher leaders, our families. These are people who care deeply about kids and about what the best practices are to do more frequently. And so I think that's one of the things I like to say to people. I've been teaching a long time. I knew that certain things worked. I just didn't know why they worked. And through working with people like Glenn and reading books of people like Tracey, now I understand. I know now why some of the things I did 20 years ago worked well. But if I know that those work well, I need to do them more often. And so we all want to be more effective. That's what this work is all about. More effective teachers in classrooms so that our kids get the best possible experience.
So I want to bring this down to talk about some sort of specific concrete examples, because I think that might be helpful for the journalists in the audience in particular. So Meg, you mentioned, for example, that there were things that you were doing for years that seemed to be working and you just didn't know why, and learning about the brain science has helped you understand why. I want to flip around, and any of you can take this. What are some concrete examples of things the other way around, things that people are doing that don't have evidence behind them? And what are those things? What's the evidence? And then what does that mean about practice? Like what are you supposed to do instead? Can we give the journalists some concrete ideas of a few of the concepts, ideas, things we're talking about here?
I'll jump into that. There's one of the biggest wastes of money in schools is our learning styles inventories. People spend an awful lot of money trying to pigeonhole kids into a style of learning based on, whether or not they're visual, kinesthetic, or auditory learners. And that is just, so wrong, because your brain really wants to learn through all its senses. It does not want to silo off. But if you're told, at 10 years old, you are a visual learner, Emily, well, you spend the rest of your life seeking out visual stimuli, and you become you have a preference for things based on that, but your brain doesn't really want to do that, right? So that's one of the worst ways to spend money. I just added into the chat maybe some links to 40 pedagogies that do have good support behind them. As Meg was pointing out, we jumped on the bandwagon of growth mindsets, which came from psychology. But if you understand that Carol Dweck was inspired by neuroplasticity, then you understand, okay, all of the learning sciences are really rallying behind certain approaches, right? And so what we tried to do is to list out things, just certain types of mastery learning or deeper learning or growth mindsets, and how do you actually reach those things through practical applications in the classroom that we can say is really supported by evidence. And so anyways, the learning styles one is one of my pet peeves, but I also really get stressed out about people who still presume that there's a difference by gender, that abilities by gender are changed. And I think that that's one of the most damaging things, because it actually limits people's potential. Half of your population feels limited in their potential to do well academically. And I think that those are pretty damaging. I'm sure all of us have our own pet peeves. I don't know, Glenn, what do you think?
What's yours, Glenn?
No, I'm like making a list. Thanks for the time. Speaking from the I perspective, my first class I ever taught was in 1991 in Spokane, Washington. And I did not understand. I thought I teach, they learn. Like, that's my job, right? And I still teach history. What I didn't understand, and we still have to convince teachers, the interrelationship between emotion and cognition has been a game changer for me as a history teacher. Like, this is where you need to know, a lot of us had 9th grade biology if you were educated in the US. This is where you got to revisit that textbook just for a moment. If you know a little bit about the limbic system, right, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex and the higher order thinking parts of your brains, you understand that learning is an emotional and social experience. And, I love my content. I love teaching history, but that is a game changer. But I still think we fight some windmills on that. And I think that goes also into how we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in our schools, right? Every kid brings his, her, or however they identify, their identity to our classes. If a kid's not in the right stress or low stress place, learning can't happen. And I would like to think, despite all the great work that's being done out there, we still have to convince educators about the connection between emotion and cognition. It's one of the reasons why, I'll just give you a funny, I will never give a surprise quiz for points ever again in history. It creates, even if a student did all the work the night before, we know certain students will bomb that quiz because of the fight, flight, flee element. And I'm not evaluating learning at that point. So I get excited about this stuff, so I'll pass it on. But I love Tracey's example about learning styles, and I hope those were some pretty good examples for the reporters in the audience.
Yeah, the learning styles thing still really blows people's minds because there's really
Yep.
deep belief in that. And so we don't have time to go through that, but the reporters in the room, there's a lot of good stuff you can Google to, to take apart the whole learning styles myth. Meg, what have been some of the biggest challenges for you when you work with teachers and other people in the Frederick County schools? What are the beliefs that they hold on to that turn out not to have a lot of evidence behind them, and you've got to change their minds? How do you do it?
Well, it's interesting. I think one of my pet peeves that people who work with me know about is the right brain, left brain. Well, I'm right brain, I'm left brain. I just had an interesting interaction with my sister about that yesterday. She saw something on social media and thinks that she's right or left brained. And I said, no, you're not like right brain or left brain. And I think sometimes it's also just that we don't need to change teachers' practice as much as we need to tweak things and help them understand what they should do more often and what they should do less often. And here's a really concrete example. Really important that we allow kids to forget a little bit so that then they can recall, right? Because it's in remembering that learning is really enhanced. And so we want them to get a little bit rusty and we want them to recall. And some teachers they haven't kind of gotten there in their understanding of how memory works. And so they like to have these neat units of content where students study for an exam, they take it, and then they never see that content again. And we all lived that. I know I certainly did as a college student. You cram for an assessment, you take it, and then a month and a half later, you don't remember anything about it. And so instead, we're really looking at how can we embed retrieval and make sure that we can teach students even how to enhance their own study strategies and their own memory. And one of my favorite, very concrete strategies that our teachers use is called last. Something from last class, something from last week, something from last month, something from last week, something from last month, something from last semester. And so just bringing back and having people pull out of their memory, what do they remember, get it on paper, have a discussion about it. These are all sort of things that our teachers don't need a lot of technical understanding to make that work. And it's not a lot of extra time invested. It's just a small change, a small shift in practice that if done deliberately can really make a difference for kids. So those are some of the things that we're really trying to move forward.
You said, Meg, last what?
Last class. So maybe it's a question from yesterday's class, a question from last week, a question from last month, just to make sure that rather than just now we're on decimals and last month we were talking about long division, well, no, we're going to actually continue to go back to what we have learned in previous units, rather than just steamrolling on through, and maybe we'll see that again next year. I think even teachers have really seen a lot of success with something like that.
Those are some great examples, and those are all kinds of things that are really good stories for reporters to do. There's, another really good story, something that I'm obsessed about is sort of the why of this. And you talked about this, Tracey, the sort of why do these neuro myths exist? How did they get started? How do they persist? Why is it so hard to get away from them? You have this great chart. Can we put this up for the audience? Do we have that, Lori? Could people see this? I don't know if you could, or you could talk us not just very briefly, and maybe people can look at it afterwards, but this is basically something that Tracey put together and its reasons for neuromyths. And I just think if reporters just take a look at this, it will spark all kinds of ideas for stories. Do you want to talk about that for 1 second?
Yeah, there's a whole lot there. I mean, there's some fundamental reasons that myths get perpetuated. And one of the biggest reasons I think Glenn alluded to at the very beginning is that it's really awesome to think about the brain, the most complex organism in the entire universe, And hi, teachers, you're responsible for it. And so there's kind of this scare factor there of, wait, there's too many levels to this or too many layers. And so the way Meg just described this idea, what she described is called interleaving. It's what your brain needs to do when you visit something, you leave it alone for a little while, you revisit it, you leave it alone for a while, you come back to it, and you're reinforcing these neural networks for memory. And that, is, there's tons of evidence for why that actually works. But as teachers, we're so used to teaching, unit 1, and let's move on to unit 2. And we just disassociate understanding, throughout there. So one of the things is understanding your brain is complex. It builds, you can't learn without memory and attention systems. And so any way we can reinforce memory and attention, we're getting there. But to understand that memory and attention aren't just one little thing in the brain, that there's a lot of sub-elements to memory and a lot of sub-elements to attention, is a little bit scary. So complexity is one of the reasons that neural myths persist. People just want the easy answer. A second thing is just, commercialism. There are some people making a whole lot of money selling you brain-based anything. Neuro is sexy right now. So anything with that title, and journalists know this, you put that in your lead and boom, everybody reads it because it's a thing right now, which is really, it's great that people are interested, but they should be getting quality information as they're doing that. I think that other huge reasons, and there's a whole lot there, but one of them is bandwagonism. It's basically, well, the teacher next door is doing it, I guess I should do it too, without even questioning where it came from. So without knowing where the information came from, why is it recommended? Why should I be doing this particular thing? This is how, for example, the Mozart, the classical idea, the classical music enhances learning sort of got out of hand. And not even the original researchers still believe that. After they weren't able to replicate their study, they realized, oops, sorry, we retract. But 2 years down the line, people had commercialized this and they were selling it like hotcakes. And so people love any way you can make something hard simple. And the brain is not simple. And that's really the biggest challenge there, is sort of getting teachers to just love their brains as complicated as they are, and just embracing that. And as Glenn was saying, very few universities, there's a consortium, Dean's Pact, which has a consortium of teacher colleges that are trying to now integrate the learning sciences into their general teacher formation, but that is not the norm. And so I get a lot of teachers in my course at Harvard. It's called the Neuroscience of Learning. It's an introduction to mind, brain health, and education. And I get teachers using it as their professional development, because as teachers, maybe 5, 10, 20 years ago when they became teachers, this was not on anybody's agenda. And now they have to get up to speed really fast. But you don't get that in a one-off conference. You sort of have to have a sustained experience to be able, we know that you can teach knowledge and skills super fast, but you can't change attitudes super fast. So in a whole long semester, though, we're able to get that shift. And I think also the programs that Megan and Glenn are doing, which sort of accompany teachers for the long haul. It's not just a one-off. You're there for the long haul, because attitudinal change is really hard. If you believe something, and we know this, from all kinds of things in social media now, cognitive ontology is the formal term. How do people believe stuff? People believe crazy stuff, but where do they get those beliefs? Getting them to change some of their crazy beliefs, things like neuromyths, is really hard, and it takes time. And so you have to sort of approach it on multiple levels. But the reason that they exist, I think we're sharing that graphic. Lori is going to be sending that out, but there's lots of reasons they exist. Knowing that is only half the battle. Okay, now we have to address it. How do we now stop those things from happening? How do we embrace complexity? How do we reject the commercialism and all those things?
Just to jump, oh, sorry, go.
Well, no, I just want to tell the audience to please make sure you're putting questions, because we're going to turn to your questions in about 5 minutes if we can. And go ahead, Glenn, and then I have a question for Meg, and then hopefully we can turn to the audience.
No, I just wanted to confirm Tracy's point, interest and enrollment in her course. Meg and I just spent the last 2 weeks with over 400 educators from around the world, 24 states, 6 countries, on a virtual Science of Teaching School Leadership Academy. Public-private charter, which very rarely happens. You have all those in the same space. So there is this searching by teachers of, are there some promising research and strategies in how the brain learns that I just don't have in my toolkit yet? So hats off to those teachers, because they just come out of the most complex school year in history. Who knows what we're going into? But they gave up parts of their summer, or maybe a semester course with Tracey. And we also know a lot more, not only about the student learning brain, but as Tracey alluded to, the adult learning brain, right? Maybe the learning curve's a little steeper, but we do know more research on that. So there is a hunger for teachers for high quality professional learning experiences. And we saw it ourselves with educators over the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed in my own reporting is I think, sometimes these little like genies get out of the bottle without much evidence, and they, for some reason, they take off. And one of them is commercialism. I mean, there are people who are making a lot of money off of it, but also some of these ideas come along and they actually really solve real problems that teachers have. They suddenly become a really good solution. And this is really the danger in this, because people can get so excited about something because it's solving a problem they have. And it's so fascinating I've been looking at this with reading instruction just over decades and decades, is like, why do things become popular? Well, a lot of times it really is because it is something that is solving a problem, but it's only one, it might not be the right solution, or it might just be one little part of the solution, and we all go way over here, and it's a big problem. I want to ask 2 more quick questions. Teacher preparation was brought up, and I want to ask you about this, Meg, because I know, this is a big part of it, is that teachers either aren't learning this stuff, or in some cases they go to teacher prep and they learn some stuff that's just actually wrong and not right. It sort of fuels some of the wrong beliefs that they have. So you're actually working directly as a public school system with some of the teacher preparation programs in your area. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? How's it going?
Well, we're doing it because we are really committed to the long haul of having the best teachers we can in our system. And one of the goals that we have is for every teacher in our system to understand how the learning brain works and how it learns best. So in order to do that, we've decided to attack it from multiple layers, because not one thing won't change the needle. So the first thing we decided to do is to make sure that our comprehensive induction program, which is 3 years for new teachers, is grounded in the science of learning. So they all get, for the first 3 years they work with us, a firm foundation in this work. And that we're doing instead of spending our time on other pieces. We thought that will build something for the long term. But we also thought our partners, our higher education partners, have an interest here, and we have a real interest in making sure that those people who are educating our future teachers, and they're also providing graduate level work to our current teachers and our school leaders. We need them to understand this work. And so we've reached out to network with them, and they're participating in things. Several of them were in the academy that Glenn and I were facilitating in the last 2 weeks. They're working with us to overhaul some of their courses and educational research because they're outdated. They've contacted me to look at some of their textbooks and find out, like, is this still aligned with what is currently in the research? We're also interacting with research partners, not just here in the United States, but around the world. Chartered College of London is one of the places that we've been talking to, just to make sure that we are not jumping on bandwagons. We're looking really deeply. And I think to speak to that as well, we're also teaching teachers to be healthy skeptics and to ask the tough questions. Maybe this program worked for someone, but does it work in our conditions with students like ours? Is it the right fit for me? And lots of things that are marketed, they're marketed with these great taglines that they're brain-based or brain-friendly. But if those conditions aren't similar to the ones in your school or your classrooms, or if that's not meeting a need that you have, it's really wasteful. And so I think getting teachers to think like that they're, curators of educational expertise, and they also are informed by educational research. And that would be something really interesting for some of the journalists to dig into as well. Higher ed and K-12 and how those two are working together to solve some of these issues. Because we need everyone on board. And that's why our higher ed partners are key to building our future as a research-informed school district.
So we're going to go to questions in just 1 second, but COVID and learning loss has come up several times. And I think it's a reason, I guess I want to ask this question. it's not like this whole learning science is some silver bullet with all of this, but I certainly have noted in my own reporting that people seem to be, I think, maybe more interested in this topic, and it has something to do with, like, what's the relationship between the work you're doing and what we're all thinking about in terms of COVID and learning loss, and why does this topic sort of matter right now? The topic of the learning science, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I'd say that there's two huge things to think about there. One, when you look at the learning brain, there is really what a lot of teachers know about constructivism, right? How you construct your own knowledge, right? Well, there's such a thing as radical neuroconstructivism. Your brain interacts with the world, and it's really literally building these networks up. And this really shows us you can't skip a step. You're missing some core prerequisite knowledge, you're not going to be able to advance. So you basically, there's no way that you can just sort of, oh, we missed second grade, oh well, because all of these sub skills, any sub element, to be able to subtract well, you have to know how to add well, because it just builds off of these things, right? And so we have to really think about that. How are we allowing kids to fill in that prerequisite knowledge that they might have missed out on because of COVID? Have we created these safety nets? This is kind of what we mean by universal design for learning. Have you designed something that creates what all, the lowest common denominator needs, as well as the high flyers? Have I provided resources so that we're going to be able to fill in those gaps, maybe as differentiated homework, for example, so that kids can all meet the same objectives? That would be one thing. But the second thing for the science of learning that I think is huge is what Glenn mentioned at the beginning. One thing that we found time after time, I work with schools in about 40 different countries, and number one, it hit the fan and everybody realized you have to prioritize mental health. If we do not prioritize well-being, there's no way you're going to get to higher cognitive thinking. You're not going to be able to talk about school subjects if you haven't prioritized mental health. And so we realized that just being together, commiserating even, was a joyful thing for teachers, but then moving on and helping their kids do the same thing worked through this process. So without having those stages of sort of, I recognize this has been rough, what can we do together? And the first thing I would do is send them all off into breakout rooms where they just sort of vent a little, and then they come back feeling so empowered because they realize I wasn't in it alone. Everybody's been doing this, and congratulations, look at what we managed. How powerful, it didn't kill us, it made us stronger. Look at where we are now. And so it's sort of getting to that other side of this that I think is really important for teachers. And also, just to sort of remember, I think that I'm half Japanese, there's something very Zen about this whole thing, that something good, yin and yang, something good has got to come out of this horrible thing. And I think this has really catalyzed a lot of interest in the brain, how it really learns, the need to take care of basic mental health before you go into higher cognition, how these hierarchies of learning work. All of these things are finally in front of everybody. And I think it's a wonderful platform to be working from right now.
So I'm sure Glenn and Meg have things to say, but looking at the clock, I want to turn to audience questions now. And so I'm going to turn it back to Lori Crouch, who is going to moderate the questions from the audience. And I also want to say that the last question I wanted to ask all the panelists, which I'll just put out there now, and maybe you can sneak it into one of your responses, is specific story ideas. Like, what's a story you'd really like someone to write? What's a headline you'd like to read? So maybe you can squeeze that in, but I'm going to let Lori go to the audience. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. Actually, that was a question I was going to go ahead and ask ahead of the audience questions. So yeah, please do answer that question, and then we'll go to audience questions.
Oh, I got a few, but I would probably say I'll be a little. I would say Department of Education finally mandates science of teaching and learning requirement for all future teachers. I know that will not sit well with everybody who reads it, but we have dedicated schools of education in this country. They're some are starting to integrate the science of teaching and learning. Tracey referenced the Deans for Impact pushing it. If I could see that headline and be part of the journey with anybody, I think students are going to be much better served in the future.
Great.
I think one of the things that we'd like to see more of are ways to amplify the work in public education. A lot of our our network partners are in private and independent schools. And while that's great, our conditions are often different. And as Emily hinted earlier, we have much larger organizations to move. And so I think how we can leverage some of the leadership strategies and leverage resources and leverage some of our support networks to move other public school districts into our space, to even just start thinking about research differently, to start thinking about the practices that Tracey has set forth more frequently would be a big help. And I think there's a lot of desire there to do the best things for kids. I think I'd just like to see how we could move some larger school districts into the space with us.
And I have a punchy headline for you guys, sort of in the same vein here. Teachers are learning scientists. I just would love for the perspective to shift to this thing of we value so much the art in our practice of teaching, but there's a science to the practice of teaching too. And so balancing this art, this artful way that teachers integrate kids and differentiate their learning and make things work for everybody is beautiful, but they have to do it with evidence, which is why I would say that teachers are learning scientists. And the moment we can embrace that, I think that we're really on our way.
Thank you all. So our first question is from Jill Barchet of the Hechinger Report, and she asks, Tracey, how can we learn more about the neuroscience myths and the new developments that you referenced over the past 15 years?
There are a lot of great things starting to come out of programs that have to do with mind-brain education science. There's a wonderful lots of programs going on academically in universities that are beginning to look into the educational neuroscience field. There are certain publications. I invite you also to look at our website at thelearningsciences.com. Our course at Harvard leverages the best that we can find in technology and in neuroscience. So we flip everything. So all of our videos are there. So we do a short video, for example, on memory or attention or cognition and emotions and the role of affect and learning and language and all of these different things. We have short videos that are up there already and our students review those, they come to class, and then we do deep dives into that information. And so we share that publicly because we want that information to get out to the world. So we hope that that can be shared. And Lori has also curated this list of other suggested resources that we'd love you to look into. But Jill, if you have a specific area of interest, we also have what are called bundles, which are mini libraries in which we hyperlink to the best evidence possible for any particular topic. So I added one in there. Here's a lot of evidence against learning styles. I just gave that as an example in the chat there, so you can see there is evidence out there. So if you have a specific area, Jill, and you want to write me, I'm very happy to sort of point in directions towards really high quality information on that. But if it's for teachers, I would say, you know, Glenn's program is just amazing and sort of inspiring teachers to go in that direction. Or the books that I've been trying to write to really speak to a teacher who is ready to be sophisticated in their understanding of this is the evidence, the why behind things, as Meg says, is really the point of my book. It's not a teaching for dummy books. It's meant for the teacher who's willing to own this. The brain is complicated and I can handle it. And just, you know, believing in yourself at that level. So if you do have specific questions though about a particular area, I'm very happy to give you a specific resource if you can be more precise or write me. Thanks.
Yep.
Great. I'm sorry, Glenn, did you want to add anything?
No, I'll just piggyback on that. You know, we created some Face the MBE Facts or Neuromyth cards to bring playful professional learning. So again, we're thinking about scale, right? Yeah, oh, there, Meg's modeling, great, thanks, Meg. But my interest is how do you scale this to big districts? And thinking about the adult brain who likes to play too. A card game has been fun, and you know, just want to see. I threw that in the chat. Maybe we can put that in our links.
Thank you. from Katie Schwartz. What is the U.S. Department of Education's stance on the science of reading? You all mentioned something.
Science of learning or science of reading?
It's a science of reading.
Really interesting. There's a nice summary if you want to look at the history of literacy education that just came out. But I'm glad you asked this, and I think and I'd love to talk to Emily more about this, but we're writing a book called Think Right. It's about thinking to write and writing to think, the neuroscience of writing. So literacy is really interesting, Katie, because people have only studied reading. They're not studying writing, and writing is it's even more complicated than reading in the brain. But it's pretty much the highest order thing you can ask a brain to do. It's really fascinating to look at the neural networks that are involved. And so, again, if you want some specifics on this, the Department of Education kind of froze. In 2000, there was a big encounter to talk about the learning sciences and what do we know from neuroscience to education. Now, that was 21 years ago. And there was a lot of naysayers in the bunch and sort of, it's not going to happen, it's, doomsdayers. But since then, everybody shifted gears, including John Brewer, who wrote a recent article, 2014, sort of totally shifting gears. Everybody buys into this now. So the idea is, how do we get the word up to policymakers? And so there are a handful of people who have that bridge in the National Institutes of Science. Jack Schonkoff at the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard is in everybody's ear about early childhood and brain things, but understanding the pre-literacy, he does a whole lot on pre-literacy preparation. But one of the things that we've found is that we did a study for the government of Costa Rica. There's about at least 60 neural networks that branch off into more than 117 pathways that have to be primed before a kid actually reads. And all of these things have to happen before he reads. And if he's not getting stimulated in all of those areas, he doesn't read fluently. And it's a sad thing that teachers don't know that. They don't know that just teaching symbol to sound is not the only thing you have to do. You have to work on working memory, and you have to build vocabulary. There's a whole lot of other things going on there. But I'm sure Emily can speak to this better than I can. Go ahead, Emily.
I muted myself because I thought I was done. I don't know if I have anything in particular to add to that, except to amplify what you said about writing. That is absolutely, the reading researchers know that it hasn't gotten nearly as much attention, but writing and spelling in particular are, very high order things. They're sort of like the other side of reading, but it's not really like an even coin. Like it's much more difficult to do. And it's interesting because like a lot of people have sort of felt like it's okay to say like, well, I'm not a very good writer, or it's particularly I'm not a very good speller. And if you're saying things like I'm not a very good speller, there's a whole lot of things about your written language that you don't know, that you haven't been taught, that you don't understand, that are missing holes for you, that foundational knowledge. And teaching kids writing really improves their reading a huge amount. It's really important.
And I'll add to that, Emily. I mean, as Tracey pointed out, reading is so complex, right? If kids don't get a head start on reading, right, achievement gaps get bigger, equity gaps get bigger. We know. But what are teacher-friendly things? So I'll just one more resource share now that we're all cognitively overloaded. We've actually created an elementary roadmap for educators, and we have a literacy tab, a section, to not oversimplify reading, but to get teachers in the space of understanding there is a science behind reading. The science is strong. Tends to be agreed upon more outside the U.S. than inside the U.S., but I'll let that go. But if any reporter wants to get a hold of our elementary roadmap, feel free to just email me.
Great, thanks, Glenn. And speaking of which, Heather Walsh asks, Glenn mentioned stress. I'm curious how you all are thinking about the ways pandemic stress is affecting student learning and how teachers, families, caregivers might help with that moving forward.
My district's really taking, we're taking that on head on. And in terms of using our science of learning lens to really focus on human development and whole child development, and making sure that we are attending to the social, emotional, the identity, the cognitive, the physical and mental health, as well as the academic development of our kids, and really thinking about that link between emotion and cognition, and how important it is to recognize that a certain amount of stress is really good for learning, and too much stress shuts learning down. So the idea that, you want to be in that sweet spot. If it's not stressful enough, it's not engaging and it's boring and the brain turns off. If it's too stressful, you get the shutdown. So you really want to hit that sweet spot. And I think there are lots of ways that as adults, we can help to encourage kids to build strategies for dealing with stress in healthy ways. And we can recognize that stress, teach kids to start recognizing that stress. Our school district has a social emotional learning curriculum, and we have, there's nothing better than walking into a kindergarten or first grade class and seeing all the kids practicing turtle. So they curl up and practice being a little turtle on the floor, because that's one of their calming strategies. And they say, when I get anxious or upset, I can practice being a turtle for a little while, and then that helps me to feel better and be able to come back and do what I need to do. And it's just great to see kids taking their own ownership of that and how they deal with stress, and realizing that is a normal part for all of us. And I think we also have to think about teacher stress, especially now, the stress of our educators, our teachers, our school leaders, our employees in support. It's been a very stressful time for education employees in general. And I think recognizing that we need to be as simple and clear in our communications to them. We need to value each of them as employees and look at what their needs are as they work with us. All of those things are also part of honoring the adult brain.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that, Meg, and say, we often think of when we talked about stress before COVID, it's a soft skill, it's non-cognitive, which talking about driving me nuts. But I'll just put that aside. Therapist is probably helping me out with that one. But Turnaround for Children, Dr. Pam Cantor, who I love their work, right? They've created a well-being index, free resource for teachers and schools and districts to use. We've addressed stress in the daily schedule of school, both pre, during, and for most schools in this country. They changed their schedule last year for health, safety, and well-being purposes. If there's one hope that I want to share, I hope reporters will share, is I hope they don't go back to March 2020. Most school days are very not cognitively friendly, nor are they unstressful. But most of them have adjusted. It's an area I really hope we think about to create sort of research-informed schedules, thinking about cognitive load, connecting between class periods. I mean, some kids have no passing time to build relationships. So I want us reporters, please help us out. These are not soft skills. These are not non-cognitive skills. Stress, emotion makes the difference if their students are in a good place for kids to meet their peak potential, certainly as they go through their educational journey. Sorry, I got very excited there. That's okay.
Well, Glenn, I just want to jump in and say some of the loss that we're going to see, when you hear people talk about learning loss, I prefer to use a term like unfinished learning myself for those things that are academic skills. But I think one of the losses kids really have had is social emotional development. So they've lost progress in relating to each other, having time to talk. They've lost progress in what purposeful play looks like at the elementary level. These are different kinds of losses that could be delved into, but they're just as important for development.
I would just say the same thing, that when they interviewed kids, actually, here in New York, when they allowed the kids to go back to school, it was really interesting. They were talking to the kids in the line of the school, just saying, well, why are you happy to go back? And fascinating, because we found this across the board as well. They wanted to go because they wanted to meet new friends, which was really fascinating, because they had found a way to meet up with the old friends. They'd maintained some kind of connection to them, either social media or calling each other, or somehow they connected. But there's this innate human desire to be with others. Most people at some level accept and understand that learning is social. And the way I know myself better is by knowing the other. The more others I know, the better I define myself, because your brain is constantly comparing and contrasting who I am with what's going on, what I know with what is being taught to me. So this dynamic was lost for a long time. And this spontaneous way of doing this, as Meg is saying, you know, out in the playground, was gone for a long time. And I think those things we have to create spaces as teachers to allow for that kind of free connection to kids. I'm just going to draw an analogy here with the brain. There's wonderful new research in neuroscience showing how mind wandering is so beneficial to thinking and creative insight. And here we are in school, we stay on task, focus, and all of a sudden we're learning all these other things. Same thing, we thought that school is a space for learning. Well, we're now learning that school is a place for socialization, and your brain needs to socialize in order to learn, and knowing itself better by understanding others is part of that. And so I hope teachers really embrace that when they go back and make those spaces for those informal connections, because that is really what it's all about.
Thanks so much. Here's a really interesting question from Ava Marinelli. How does neurodiversity fit into this conversation? Recall is obviously important, for example, but is a huge hurdle for many neurodiverse students with executive functioning disorders. How do we set those students up for success when leveraging brain science that's rooted in the neurotypical brain?
So I'll take a stab at that, and I would just like to say, just as I really cringe when somebody says brain-based learning, I cringe, I'm sorry, at neurodiversity, because we are all neurodiverse, okay, number one, but nobody has an identical brain. We can track certain neural pathways for typical reading things, for example, but nobody's identical because your personal life experiences change that. Now, obviously, some people are born with different types of potentials in different areas. And one of the fantastic things that we found, especially in applying or understanding these general trajectories of learning in this radical neuroconstructivism I was mentioning before, is that order matters. The order and presentation of information at its core roots, to be able to then scaffold onto higher learning. And this is independent of the level of innate intelligence of an individual or anything. So we have to keep that in mind. One of the beautiful things that we found is that anything that you do to support people who we call neurodiverse, or to have a more inclusive classroom settings, anything you do that speaks to that person is going to help everybody, believe it or not. So if you have people that might be on on the autism scale, or if you have people that might have attention problems, if you've created an instructional design for your course that appreciates that, what you've done is created those safety nets where we have, here is my spectrum of learners, that's humanity. So I've got some people who are going to need this kind of support, and I've got some other people that are high flyers and they need to be stretched. So have I provided the resources that will challenge everybody in the right way possible, where I can meet my students at their starting point, even though we're trying to share a goal together? So how do I use that? And part of that is design. It's a huge thing, and we've all learned as teachers how to create lesson plans, but that is not designing education that attends to everybody's needs. Attending to everybody's needs is understanding those neurodiverse populations, understanding the people who are going to learn a little bit differently, and creating the resources that will support them in class. I think it's one of the saddest things that we do in the United States is to pull people out in special needs. If you go to other parts of the world, you see that, guess what? 100% of the population is special needs, because everybody's going to need some help at some point. And so we don't stigmatize kids by labeling them. Any label you give, even if it's gifted, is a label and it's negative. So by just understanding this is society. We have a neurodiverse population in the world, and this is our classroom. And teachers have to buy into that. We did a very big disservice in around 1967 when we decided to do special education classrooms. Special ed for me is really the extremes, extreme and low mental intelligence, and also kids who are blind and deaf often are better off in other situations. But everybody else, including kids lower on high functioning autism, as well as kids with all kinds of other learning difficulties, should be in the classroom, in my opinion, because that is that's society, and we all learn from that, and it's so enriching. I grew up in Berkeley, California in the 60s, public schools, and it was fantastic. We had kids who were you know, very, very challenged. And then we had kids who were taking classes at UC Berkeley in high school. You had the whole spectrum there, and we were all in the same school together. And it makes such a difference in how you view society. I would just, sorry for the rant there, but I really feel strongly that integration is the best thing, but teachers need to have the tools to do it. They need to know how to be able to attend to those needs, because many teachers aren't prepared to do that. And that is a disservice to any individuals who has those needs. So training is part of it.
We're at 3 o'clock, but I do want to ask this one last question. We have a whole bunch of questions we didn't get to, and I apologize, audience, that we couldn't get to everyone's. But I do want to ask this one, if you all don't mind sticking around for about 3 or 4 more minutes and answering this last one very quickly. It's another one from Jill Barchet of the Hechinger Report. Meg, we've known about the power of spaced retrieval practices for decades, and countries with a national curriculum have embedded this into their lessons for a long time. For example, the Soviet Union back in the day is the lack of a national curriculum or even a statewide curriculum an impediment for incorporating the science of learning in instruction?
That is such an interesting question, Jill. I think there are a couple of things to consider. I think the first one is yes, and even in Frederick County Public Schools, I can tell you that our curriculum developers and their understanding of these principles and promising practices has changed our curriculum trajectory because they have embedded these kind of skills. Although I would say that there are 2 additional layers that need to happen. So changing the curriculum is part 1. But part 2 is, does the teacher really understand the power of that change? Because I think that is significant in the teacher being able to apply that strategy in other settings. So beyond, and to customize it for the students who, as Tracey just really articulated, have very different brains in the classroom. So we don't have one size fits all. So the one size fits all curriculum choice really doesn't look at that art part of teaching and the teacher's personal expertise. But then the next layer is, it's not enough to have it just invisibly embedded in the curriculum and have the teacher understand it. We really need to go to the next level and make sure our learners understand it. Because one of the people that I admire very much is an author named Patrice Bain. And she used to tell her middle school students, my name is Mrs. Bain, and my job is to teach you how to learn. And there's a real difference there. She wasn't just teaching social studies. She was teaching kids how to learn. And so if that's just invisibly included in a national curriculum, it doesn't get to the layer where our kids can actually have the agency to understand, you know what, I think as I want to learn this, these are the strategies I need to put in place to make that happen. So I think while that might be a cursory solution, it's really not where we want to be, because we want to have the curriculum, the teacher who has the expertise, and the student who has the agency to employ the learning sciences as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add very quickly, most of the curriculum fears of a national curriculum is around content, the what, right? Should we teach the Civil War? How should we teach an honest history about race and gender, right? In some ways, and this is going to be an oversimplification, so people yell at me in email, what Tracey, myself, and Meg are sharing is somewhat content agnostic, right? I don't want to get into content wars, but I know there's pedagogy, there's strategies that the teachers can facilitate and lead, or as Meg said, we grow student agency and understand about their learning brain. So in some ways, if we could just forget about the content wars and let states, districts fight that out, I would argue we are content agnostic in some ways to make that content, whatever they choose, stick. Now, can we move a country? Challenging. But I'm an eternal optimist and love to talk to more people about this. I want what I love to teach to stick better. I'm going to use spacing, retrieval, metacognition, more formative assessment. I'm also going to ask the kids about their identity and emotion. That's going to make my stuff stick better.
I'm going to add a third angle to this and just give you one more headline. It's called The Death of the Textbook. What's really fascinating here is that the American Federation of Math Teachers has endorsed interleaving, for example, Jill. They think this is fantastic. They did a huge meta-analysis. They show the superiority of using interleaving strategies where you teach and you break off and you repeat. And that's out there. And in fact, they tell their members to do it. The only reason, the thing that's getting in their way, is that the school district buys a certain textbook that tells them on a certain date they need to be in a certain chapter, and they move through the textbook rather than adopt a pedagogy that is different, because they let their textbook define their teaching, which is a huge, huge error. And so teachers have to become more independent of that and understand that there are pedagogies they can apply, as Glenn points out, independent of whatever curriculum you're teaching. So free yourself of the textbook. Maybe that's another good title there for your headline. Sorry, it's a publishing. I know that some of you work for big publishers, but sorry, the publishing companies have somehow dictated curriculum for a long time. And this is something we really, it has to change, because you cannot apply, you can apply everything we're talking about in any structure. But the way that textbooks are designed, it dictates timelines for learning, which are not necessarily coherent with the way humans learn and the way that kids are going to need to learn through COVID.
I have a quick thought on that, which is, I think, as Glenn mentioned, I think the politics are such that the idea of a national curriculum is maybe not even worth pursuing in this country. I just think I'm just not so sure we can get there. But one of the things that I think, I agree with all the things that you guys have just said. I think the fact that it is so baked into this country that we have local control in education in particular, and more generally, supposedly, means that when we talk about curriculum and learning and how to improve it, we tend to go content agnostic. And that's part of the problem with what's going on in schools, is like in a lot of cases, there's not enough good content at the middle. So all of these things about how you teach and how you, in interleaving and all of this stuff about procedures, but we tend to go, I think in America, we just like go content agnostic because it's so scary and it gets us in fights. And we're like, oh, forget it. We can just do this without talking about the content. But the content really matters. Like what kids are learning and whether they're learning stuff matters, and how they're taught it. But I think we need to figure out a way to return to that, because some kids are really getting left behind, because some kids get a lot of content in their lives. They get it from their parents, they get it through enrichment activities, it gets paid for, and some kids don't get that content. And that is actually a source of gaps that we see across the
especially in reading and your own research. And Dan Willingham, that's a big part of the reading gap. So yes, knowledge matters. Awesome.
does.
And with that, I'm going to have to cut us off because we have gone way over time. I'm letting you all have the last word, but not so much now. So I want to thank you so much, Tracey, Meg, and Glenn, and Emily, for a wonderful discussion. And I want to thank today's attendees for joining us and asking great questions. As the webinar closes, you will see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is important and helps us to improve. And please visit our website, ewa.org/events, to sign up for other online and in-person. Yes, we're going to have in-person seminars coming up in the near future. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.